So I've got to prepare for a presentation that I'm going to give on Thursday for this paper that I have actually read online. It's about 40 pages long, and I think it takes about 45 to an hour to listen to me read the whole thing. So it's definitely a long journey. I'm actually not happy about it. Because I feel like in the presentation I'm going to touch on some points which I did talk about them in the paper, but I feel like I'm going to explain them better out loud than I did in the paper. So anyways, the idea underlying the whole paper is that mechanistic biology is inadequate, and inadequate based on the datum which we apprehend, which is not only a empirical observation of a body in an environment, in other words, the organisms that we're studying, but also our own subjective experience as knowers of those bodies. So I would say myself as a naturalist, as someone who thinks science gives us knowledge about reality, that we need to take into consideration both this subjective and objective element. And these elements are the poles in the process which is the unfolding of space-time. So mechanistic biology is inadequate, and what we need to replace it with, or at least what I would suggest we can begin to replace it with, is general systems theory, but also, more specifically, Francisco Varela's theory of autopoiesis, which can apply at multiple levels. You can talk about cellular self-production, the emergence of a membrane-bound system of components which act to produce one another and the system as a whole. You can talk about a second order or second level autopoiesis, which is a multicellular organism, which is a series or a society of smaller first order autopoietic cells working in concert, differentiating and designing a hierarchical system of complex order and communication and control. And then you can talk about just the nervous system, which is an even more complex system of hierarchical order and control, which is linguistic in nature or symbolic. And whenever you talk about language, you're also talking about the human body, because language, to make sense, must be metaphorical. We speak and mark differences in our environment by distinguishing one thing from another, by analoging one thing with another. So autopoiesis is really, or at least it exists in germ in the writing of Immanuel Kant, specifically the Critique of Judgment, where he talks about how what he calls self-organization in biological organisms cannot be explained mechanistically in terms of the kind of science that Newton and Galileo were doing or had done. So somehow Kant recognized in living creatures, and especially in human beings, a certain element of freedom. But because he thought that this freedom was noumenal, it was beyond our ability to know, he thought it was irrational. Rationality, the mind, could not come to know this thing in itself, this, the soul, the element of life or animation in animals or any organism. So that's where Kant left us. He said, physics is science, and it gives us knowledge about objective reality, but biology is philosophy because we can only guess as to what's really going on. Kant thought it was absurd to try to understand a living creature as though it were a machine or a collection of parts outside of other parts working as sort of monads in a system which hasn't emerged a larger identity and recognized itself as a whole. Because what Kant recognized through self-organization was the whole organism, in the sense that the parts of a living creature, in contrast to the parts of a machine, worked for each other. And the system as a whole was cause and effect of itself. So the causality becomes circular. And mechanistic biology doesn't recognize this. And because they don't recognize the circularity, the autopoiesis of organisms, also doesn't recognize the consciousness of organisms, because, as Varela points out about autopoiesis, as soon as you recognize that this system constitutes its own identity, you also have to impute or assume or encounter or feel phenomenologically a certain degree of sentience in that body, in that system. And so teleology for Kant and for Varela is an intrinsic element of reality itself, for two reasons really. Because the human being, as a conscious observer of reality, is intrinsically aware of a world of opportunities and purposes and desires and wishes. And so even when we're doing science, biology, chemistry, we're engaged in a certain way of valuing the unfolding of the next moment and the next moment and the next moment of reality. So objective knowledge, as sort of an outside snapshot of what reality will always be, is, well, that's what art tries to be, and we recognize that in art. It's a passing image, but it brings us to a certain place just for that moment while we're being influenced by the piece. And but it's not reality. It's a form of worship of reality, but it's not reality. It's artificial. It's an attempt at mimicry. So, I mean, even before Kant, if we go back to Aristotle, Aristotle recognized that there was a difference between the product of an artist, or the craft of a craftsman, and the organism's creative ability. The organism had its cause internal to itself, while the artist and his artifact, the artifact had a purpose which was given to it by the artist. And so there's this duality. So already in Aristotle, there's a difference recognized between what an organism is and what the supposedly dead, inorganic, material world is. So it is another form of duality there, just on a different level. And this is why Whitehead, I think, is important as a metaphysical system underlying the scientific system of Varela, because it allows us to generalize our own experience as teleological organisms and apply it to every other organism that we can distinguish in our environment. See, science, if based on empiricism, can't tell us anything about what actually exists out there. But if we generalize our experience based on a certain metaphysical system of principles, then, if we are imaginatively willing to accept these principles, will allow us to fully participate in the unfolding of the reality which we exist among other beings within. So, alright, this will be part 1, and I'll post another 10 minutes or so in part 2.